Hi everyone, I'm Sheree Atcheson and I'm here today to talk to you about accessibility by default. Firstly, a little bit about myself. I am a multi-award winning global diversity, equity and inclusion leader, and I've been doing this work for almost a decade. Previously, I was a software engineer where I worked on high-profile public sector projects, ensuring that they work for all different walks of people. I'm a global diversity, equity, and inclusion executive currently working at Valtech, which is a global design agency. Previously, I have held leadership roles at Monzo Bank, at Deloitte, and at Peakon. My work is really around creating inclusive, data driven strategies to transform internally businesses and the solutions that they create. I'm an advisory board member at Women Who Code, which is the world's largest nonprofit globally dedicated to women in technology. We have over 300,000 global members. We run free monthly events in all of our locations, and we also have given over $2 million worth of scholarships to women in technology every year. I write a lot, which I hope you enjoy, on Forbes about privilege in processes and systems, in creating inclusive technologies, in creating personal and business allyship in your policies and processes, and all of the different stuff that goes around that on how inclusion is key in society as well as business, because sometimes I think people forget that it's both. And I'm the published author of Demanding More, a book to help all of us be the change that we need to create a more inclusive society. It talks about why diversity and inclusion doesn't happen and what you can do about it, which actually I think is very apt right now. And it was also listed as one of the Financial Times best books of the summer. If you're on Twitter, I am at Nirashika and my website is shereeatcheson.com if you're interested in connecting with me. But let's get started. So firstly, why is accessibility key now, not later? Now, I know you'll have heard a lot of great sessions today, and I would love to delve into this just a little bit deeper, and especially when it comes to the creation of systems and solutions for everybody. So I'm going to go through a number of different statistics. Now, these are not the only statistics, of course, but they're just a few that I think are really key that we talk about. Excuse me. Over 7 million people, or 18%, of the working age population in Britain are disabled, as defined by the Equality Act in 2010. That's almost 20% of the British population. That's a fifth of society for the most part. How are those people being served? Are they being served? What about access? What about the use of the solutions that we use? I want us to think about how technology is intertwined into everything that we do. There is almost nothing that doesn't have technology connected with it in some way. What about these disabled people and people with neurodiversities and so on? How are those people being served? Are they being considered in those solutions? Even when we think of physical access, if you think of London specifically, how inaccessible quite a lot of the tube network is. So what does that mean for people? I think that's really important when we think about digital accessibility as well. Americans with disabilities are nearly 3 times as likely to never go online. Now, I know this is about Americans, but actually I think it's still very relevant because we work from a global context for a lot of the time. Think about going online. For most of us, that's just commonplace. You wake up in the morning, maybe you go for breakfast, maybe you check your emails on your phone, maybe you log on, maybe you're watching something like this right now. What if you never do that? Now, what does that mean when it comes to access to healthcare, access to advice, access to all of the different things that actually, how do people do that? Think about when we started dealing with the global pandemic, that a lot of the information we needed was being online, getting different applications and so on. If you're not online, What do we do about that? Now, again, if people with disabilities and disabled people are not being serviced or not being considered in these applications, well, why would they go online? But also the barrier to access is key. How do we make sure that actually all of these solutions we create work for people with different needs, whether that's mobility needs, sight needs, hearing needs, and so on? Disabled people are almost twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled people. Twice as likely. Now, I want us to think about what that means when we consider the gaps of inequity that we have seen widen through the global pandemic. We know that disabled people have been disproportionately impacted, but I also think it's key to recognise that disabled people are continually and always have been disproportionately impacted by various different issues like this because they are not being considered in the way that we need to. Their needs are not being met because as a society, policies from governments and so on have not been considering them or directly disregarding them, mostly the latter. So actually what I think is really key here from a technology perspective, when we have the privilege of creating something that people use and need to use or want to use, we do something that actually works for everyone, not just those in the majority and not just those that we directly identify with. Now, I want to share some examples of actually when this hasn't went very well, and I'm sure that you have lots of examples yourself, and there's probably ones that you're thinking of right now. And if there are ones that you're thinking of right now, I would love for you to spend some time thinking about what could have made those things better, what could have made those things not been such a catastrophic mess. So let's go through. I have 3 examples, and obviously there are many more. So the first one was after a member of the royal family passed away. Now, we've seen quite a lot of organisations making statements and so on. What we did also see was that the Real website, the National Real Inquiry's website that millions of people use to get from A to B, to get to work, to get to hospitals, to get friends and family and so on, had went completely grayscale. No announcement, no anything, went completely grayscale as part of a memory or a memoriam to that royal family member. Now, actually, what has turned out and what has happened is that, this highlighted quite a lot of accessibility issues because people with sight issues were struggling to use the website. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that someone thought we need to do something grand, we need to do something important, but they didn't consider how that would affect quite a lot of people. Now, why not? Now, we're going to talk about why not when we get to actually why we do this now and not later. But this disproportionately affected those who are visually impaired, with actually one person saying that the UK has, in quotes, completely lost the plot. But this would be funny, only it's incredibly serious, because actually when you think about the use of public transport and the groups of people that need to use public transport, for the most part are those from poor economic backgrounds as well. Now, that's not saying those are the only groups of people using it, but when you think about the need for using it to get to, for example, shift work and so on, what if you also have visibility issues? Now you can't use the website to get to where you need to go. And this is simply, it just isn't good enough. You may have seen it if you use Twitter. I use Twitter a lot. If you do use Twitter, you may have seen last year, that they launched a voice note feature where you could record your voice almost like an online voicemail, where you could record a short message for people or your Twitter followers and so on. But actually, there was no transcription service, there was no alt text, there was no accessibility considered. Now, the original response from Twitter was, well, this was a beta feature, it was something we were testing. But regardless of that, Twitter is used by billions of people. And obviously, when you don't include accessibility by default, this happens. People are forgotten about. People are disregarded. Does that mean that Twitter followers who need that kind of accessibility are less important than those that don't? The answer to that should be no, but nonetheless, a $1 billion company has continued to make mistakes like this. Is that acceptable? No, is the answer, in case you weren't sure. And whilst you may think that this isn't entirely relevant to technology, I would argue that actually it is entirely relevant to technology. So the global pandemic has affected everyone, okay? That's arguably true. However, many of us have been able to weather the storm easier than other people. Many of us have not been able to survive the global pandemic. And disabled people have been forgotten about during COVID-19 around the research around who is affected, how they're affected, access to healthcare as they needed, access to be able to access healthcare as needed, especially when the NHS was really creaking under pressure. Now, when we also think about the government's responses around whose lives are worthy and whose lives are not, what we saw was those who were elderly or in care homes and disabled folks were being forgotten again or disregarded, mostly the latter again. Now, what I think is really key here is actually that how this impacts future decisions. Decisions will be made from a technology perspective based on research like this, okay? Organizations will define strategies based on this research. Now, if disabled people have been forgotten during that research, then we continue to embed these problems on and on and on. What I also think is really key is that, last year and continually, we've seen quite a lot of redundancy rounds last year. Now, when we also impact that with the cost of living as a disabled person, which is statistically much, much higher to live with a disability because of the different care needs you may have, the impact again from a societal perspective is that we're seeing that disabled people are being forgotten about, they're not being looked after, and then technologies are being defined by those who don't have disabilities or are not listening to those that do, and creating things that just don't work for people. And I'm here to, I guess, really talk about what we can do from a technology perspective, a solution perspective, to do this better. So for me, what's really important is that we embed accessibility at every stage of your process. Now, this is regardless of whether you are in software engineering, in design, in client work, whatever it might be. I hope that you can get something useful from what I'm going to talk about now. So actually, let's talk about why we're talking about now, not later. What's really key here is that we recognize that accessibility isn't something we tack on. It's not something that we just forget about or that we just retrospectively consider. Think back to even just those examples that I've shared, when we roll out things that affect billions of people, millions of people, we continue to exclude people and discriminate against people who have always been discriminated against. So let's go through each of these stages so we can actually talk about how we do this better. Requirements gathering, regardless of whether you are rolling out a technology solution, a client piece of work, a design, whatever it might be, you always have to understand the requirements you're gathering. You always have to understand, what do people want? Why do they want it? What problem are they trying to solve? What problem do they think they're trying to solve, but actually what is it really? And the only way to figure out that information is to gather what their needs are. Now, all too often, we gather requirements for, let's say, the majority of people like here and the majority of people here. But what about that tiny slice of people that are in the middle? Now, that tiny slice of people is 20% of the British working age population, but very often they're forgotten about. So when we get requirements of just a majority, we're not actually specifically thinking about this, how our solutions may map to those with different disabilities and so on, with different impairments or mobility needs. What's really key is that we do that at the beginning, that question is asked, what do you need for this to surface for those with disabilities? What do you need to make sure is considered for those who have hearing impairments, sight impairments, mobility impairments, mental impairments, and so on. Think about that at the start and not later on. What that means is that you're starting to intertwine accessibility throughout everything that you're doing. Not just at the end, you try and tack it on, like putting a sticky plaster on an open wound. What we're trying to do here is intertwine this into everything, and requirements gathering is really, really key there. When we move into design, we're talking about accessible design, from colours, from themes, from flows, from fonts, and so on. Now, what's really key is that we don't go through the process of defining our wireframes, our imaging, our layouts without considering accessibility, because what tends to happen then is we create potentially a wonderfully beautiful design, but it's not accessible. Then we realize it's not accessible and we try to force accessibility into something where accessibility was never considered. Now, accessible design can very much be beautiful design, and what's really key is that that's considered from the start right the way through, not just at the end. Now, what's really key here is, again, the user research part. When you're designing something, ultimately a big part of that role is understanding, how does this affect different people? How do I want them to experience this platform? How do I want them to feel using it? Accessibility must be considered there, because otherwise, like I said, that group of people we talked about, we're forgetting about them again. Now, if we're not designing for them, we're excluding them. And it's as simple as that, to be honest. If we're not prioritizing accessibility, we're excluding people. Now, development, obviously, bringing something to life is key here. Now, what I always suggest is that, your developers must be appropriately trained on creating accessible products. It's not okay to just assume that if you have, let's say, a disabled person on your team, that they are the voice of disability for that project team. They may be more than happy and willing to share their experience and needs for, let's say, that product, but keep in mind that's personal experience, and two, you don't have any right to ask people to share. Realistically, the creation of accessible projects and accessible development is for every engineer, every single person. So it's key that you prioritize the training for that group of people. It's really key that you ensure that they recognize, well, how am I developing something that's accessible? Also, actually, from creating accessible code around comments, around spacing, around the different things that you can do to make sure, if, for example, you have people with different needs on your team, that regardless of who is looking at your code, they can still get what they need from it. They can still understand it in the best way for them. I think very often when we come to development, people sometimes forget that who's working on it now will not be who's working on it in the future. So keep that in mind. It's not just for yourself. Testing, I think, is one of those things, and I know from being an engineer that a lot of the time people view testing as something just happens over there. It doesn't really matter to the developers. The developers are apparently more important. That's incorrect. Developers are not more important than testers. Testers are incredibly important because their job is to break things. Their job is to break it and see if it actually stands up to what it needs to do. More often than not, it doesn't, and that's why they're there. They're there to test that before it's deployed. Now, what's key is, from a testing perspective, that we test this from accessibility needs and perspectives. That grayscale website or Twitter voice notes, if testing had been appropriately considered, oh, well, does this work for people who have hearing issues on Twitter? Oh, well, can people with sight impairments use the train website? Well, maybe then we wouldn't have had these issues. So testing is key. It needs to be rigorous and it needs to be well detailed out. You can't just do one test and assume that it's okay. So it's really key to really prioritize that. Deployment and support work hand in hand for me. When you come to deployment, firstly, we're talking about the software deployment, but also actually the launch, the marketing, the online eminence that you may do for any launch or change, etc. Is that accessible? What about the materials that you are using? Does it really represent society as a whole, or does it represent a small bubble of people? Disabled people are not an add-on. This disability and accessibility work is not a nice to have. This is something that we must have and we must prioritize. So when we think of development, that's really key. Support is also key because, like I said, this is an iterative approach. guidelines are continually changing on this as well. There's new legislation coming out in Europe. We have various different guidelines around the WCAG and the ADA in America, for example. And what's key is that as those things change, you continually support that solution. You are actively seeking what needs to change, going back, gathering requirements, design, development, testing, etc. Because actually what's working now is probably not what's going to be working in a number of years. So it's really, really important that we prioritize this work through every single stage of that process. Now that means that you have to have checks and balances at every stage of the process. Do not make assumptions that something works just because you feel like it will, just because it's not being raised directly. You cannot assume something works until you have user research or appropriate data that proves that it works. That means utilizing different types of testing, whether it's A/B testing to check if it's working for different groups of people, all of the different things that we need to consider to make sure that before we get to deployment and before we get to support, that we are very, very confident that we know this is being considered appropriately and developed appropriately. Accessibility is not a nice to have, it's very much a need to have. We have to serve everybody. We have the privilege of doing so. And for me, that's why we have to be accessible by default. So like I said, if you're interested in learning more about my work and about how I work around privilege and challenging the power dynamics that exist, you can grab Demanding More at any bookshop that you would like, which shares actionable and measurable ways to create a more inclusive society. It has great interviews with different people in leadership like Anne Boden, the CEO of Starling Bank, Murray Williams, who's a globally renowned CTO, and a whole host of other people that I think you could learn a lot from. I know I definitely did. So if you have any questions, I'm really excited now to go to questions as well. And you can always get me on ShereeAtcheson.com. Thank you.